I always thought I knew every frequency on the dial. Working the late shift at WQPR 103.3 FM, a local station barely scraping by in our sleepy town, I prided myself on being able to find any station with a twist of the knob. But the night I found the forgotten broadcast, everything changed. It started like any other shift, sipping stale coffee, queuing up old rock tracks, and reading the same tired local news to an audience that probably wasn't even awake. The graveyard shift was lonely, but I liked it that way. It was just me, the glow of the console, and the soft hum of static between songs. But that night, something was off. The station's old transmitter had been acting up, sending weird bursts of interference through the speakers. I figured it was a hardware glitch. WQPR had been running on outdated equipment since the 90s. So I did what I always did, manually tuned the frequencies to see if the problem was external. That's when I found it. At 89.7 FM, where there should have been nothing but static, a faint voice broke through. At first, I thought it was another station bleeding through the signal. But then, as the static faded, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Breaking news: a tragic accident has just occurred at the intersection of Maple and Fifth. A lone pedestrian, struck by a black sedan, pronounced dead at the scene. I froze. That was 2 blocks from the station. I turned the dial, trying to pinpoint the source, but the signal was weak, wavering in and out as if it didn't belong on the frequency at all. Then, barely a minute later, my phone buzzed on the desk. A news alert: pedestrian killed in a hit-and-run at Maple and Fifth. Black sedan last seen fleeing the scene. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. It wasn't possible. The broadcast had reported it before it happened. I told myself it was a fluke, a weird coincidence. Maybe I'd misheard the timing. But then the static rose again, and the same calm, eerie voice returned. And now, for our next story. The line went dead. A chill ran down my spine. I should have turned the radio off. I should have ignored it. But something about that voice, something about the way it spoke as if it already knew, kept me listening. That was my first mistake. I sat there, gripping the edge of the desk, my breath shallow. The radio had gone silent, but the weight of the broadcast pressed down on me like a heavy fog. I checked my phone again, reading the breaking news alert over and over. The details were the same: the location, the black sedan, the fatality, and the broadcast had aired it before it happened. I swallowed hard, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of police scanner bleed-through? A weird fluke where I'd picked up a live emergency frequency? But deep down, I knew better. Police reports didn't sound like that. The voice wasn't urgent. It was detached, like it wasn't reporting the news, but telling a story that had already been written. I reached for the station's landline and dialed Eddie, our station technician. If anyone knew about strange signals, it was him. He picked up on the 4th ring, his voice groggy. "Dude, it's what? 1 in the morning? This better be good." "I think something's wrong with the transmitter," I said, glancing at the radio. I picked up a weird frequency on 89.7, some kind of news broadcast, but it predicted a hit and run. Before it happened, there was a long silence. "Predicted?" Eddie finally said. "Yeah, I rubbed my forehead, trying to piece it together. I heard the report, and a minute later it actually happened. Exact details, word for word." Eddie sighed, and I could practically hear him rubbing his face on the other end. "Probably a pirate station, man, or a rebroadcast from an old police log." "No," I said quickly. "It wasn't old. It was live." And after the report, the voice said, "And now, for our next story." Then it just cut out. Eddie muttered something under his breath. "You're sure it was 89.7? "Yeah." Another silence. Then, in a lower voice, he said, "That frequency doesn't exist." I blinked. "What do you mean?" WQPR runs between 87.9 and 107.9. We don't have anything on 89.7. Neither does any other station in the area. It's a dead channel. I frowned, turning back to the dial. Then how the hell was I picking it up? A rustling sound on the other end of the call. Eddie was probably sitting up in bed now. Where's the signal strength? I glanced at the meter. The needle barely flickered. Weak, almost non-existent. Eddie exhaled sharply. All right, I'll check the logs in the morning. See if we picked up anything unusual. Pause. But, maybe don't mess with that frequency again. I let out a shaky laugh. Trust me, I don't plan on it. But that was a lie, because deep down, I knew I wasn't going to sleep until I heard what came next. I lasted an hour. After Eddie hung up, I tried to focus on my usual shift, playing music, announcing station IDs, pretending everything was normal. But I kept glancing at the radio, waiting, listening. At exactly 2 a.m., the static returned. I didn't touch the dial. I didn't try to find it. Found me. The voice faded in, calm and emotionless, as if it had always been there, waiting. We interrupt this broadcast for an urgent report. I gripped the desk. A fire has just broken out at 12 Sycamore Lane. Authorities are responding, but the flames spread quickly. Inside, a woman sleeps, unaware of the danger. My stomach twisted. I knew that address. It was 3 streets away. I reached for my phone, hands trembling, and searched for any news updates. Nothing yet, but I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, bolted out of the studio, and ran for my car. The streets were empty as I sped through town, my pulse hammering in my ears. I took the turns too fast, tires skidding over damp pavement, until, there, 12 Sycamore Lane, and it was on fire. Flames licked up the walls, the windows glowing orange. The smell of burning would fill the air, thick and acrid. I threw the car into park and leapt out, racing toward the front door. Hey, anyone inside? No answer. I pounded on the door, the heat already unbearable. A coughing sound came from upstairs. Someone was in there. I covered my mouth with my sleeve and kicked at the door, but it wouldn't budge. I grabbed a loose brick from the garden, swung hard, and shattered a front window. Smoke billowed out. I climbed through, glass slicing my palms, and stumbled into the house. Hello! A weak voice. A woman. I followed the sound up the stairs, lungs burning. In the hallway, I found her. A woman in her 30s, coughing into her hands, her eyes wide with fear. Come on! I grabbed her arm, half dragging her down the stairs. The fire roared around us, but somehow we made it out. The second we hit the cold night air, I collapsed onto the lawn, gasping. She clung to me, sobbing. The fire raged on, devouring the house. Minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance. Firefighters pulled up, jumping into action, but I barely heard them. I was staring at my phone. A news alert had just popped up. Breaking: fire erupts at 12 Sycamore Lane. Woman rescued just in time. Cause unknown. I had heard it before it happened. Again. I turned, looking back toward the station. The studio window was glowing softly in the distance. And I knew the broadcast wasn't over. It was just getting started. I didn't go back to the station right away. I sat in my car outside the burning house, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The woman I had rescued was sitting on the curb, wrapped in a blanket by the paramedics, still shaking from shock. If I hadn't heard that broadcast, she'd be dead. The thought made my stomach twist. The voice had known. It had known about the accident. It had known about the fire. And it had known before anyone else. I needed answers. I returned to WQPR just after 3 a.m., the glow of the studio's neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness. Inside, the station was exactly as I had left it. Empty, quiet, the hum of the old equipment filling the air. I hesitated at the door before stepping inside. The room felt different now, like something had shifted. I sat down in front of the console, staring at the radio. The dial was still set to 89.7 FM, but now nothing, just dead air. I turned the volume knob, listening intently. No static, no voice. I swallowed hard. What the hell are you? No answer. Leaning forward, I tapped a few keys on the station's log system. Every broadcast we aired was recorded and stored on a local server, just in case we ever needed a playback. If 89.7 had gone live, it should have been logged. But when I checked the files, there was nothing. No records. No timestamp. Like it had never happened. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle in. Maybe Eddie was right. Maybe this was some rogue pirate station. But if that was the case, why was it broadcasting events before they happened? I sat there for a long time, listening to the silence. And then, just as I was about to turn it off, the static returned. Slow, creeping, like a whisper crawling into my ears. A chill ran down my spine. The voice spoke again. And now, for our next story. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. Tonight, a young man sits alone in a radio station, listening to a voice he should have ignored. He doesn't realize. He's being watched. My breath hitched. Someone is behind him. I spun around so fast my chair nearly tipped over. The studio was empty. Nothing but the dim glow of the equipment and the slow, rhythmic blinking of the on-air sign above the door. But the voice wasn't done. He feels safe inside his station. But he shouldn't, because tonight is his final broadcast. The radio cut to static. I sat frozen, the words sinking in like ice in my veins. This time, the broadcast wasn't about some stranger. It was about me. The air in the studio felt wrong, like something unseen was pressing against my skin. I pushed back from the console, my breath unsteady. The walls of the room seemed closer, the shadows stretching in ways that didn't make sense. This wasn't just some radio trick. Something was here. My mind raced for a logical explanation. Maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe Eddie had somehow pre-recorded the broadcast as a twisted prank. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't a joke. Slowly, I reached for my phone and called Eddie. The line rang once, twice, then a click. Hello. Eddie's voice was groggy, irritated. Dude, it's almost 4 in the morning. Eddie, I whispered. Someone's in the station. That woke him up fast. Wait, what? I heard the voice again. I said. It described me, Eddie. Said I was being watched. Said this was my final broadcast. Silence. Then, a quiet shuffle on the other end of the line. Listen to me, Eddie said, his tone sharper now. I told you to stay away from that frequency. That. A loud thud echoed from the hallway outside the studio. I flinched. Eddie, there's someone here. Another thud. Closer this time. A heavy, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the floor. I grabbed the station's emergency flashlight, my hands shaking as I pointed it toward the hallway. The doorway was dark, too dark, like the shadows had deepened. Get out, Eddie said. His voice was tight, urgent. Get out of there right now. I stood slowly, moving toward the door, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I had to pass through the hallway to get outside. Whatever was making that sound, I'd have to go past it. I took a shaky breath and stepped forward. The air turned ice cold. My skin prickled as the shadows in the hallway shifted. And then, a whisper, low, guttural, right behind me. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look. I just sprinted down the hallway, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The dragging sound followed, faster now, closing the distance. I hit the exit door at full speed, slamming into it so hard I nearly tripped. The cold night air rushed over me as I stumbled outside, gasping. Silence. Nothing followed me. No sound. No figure. Just the empty parking lot and the distant flicker of a streetlight. I turned, staring back at the station. The windows were dark, but as I stood there, heart hammering, I saw it. The figure, standing in the control room behind the glass. Tall, motionless, watching me, and then, the radio inside flickered back on. The voice whispered one last time. See you soon. I didn't sleep that morning. I sat in my car in the parking lot, staring at the darkened radio station, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I knew I had. That thing, the figure in the control room, wasn't possible. It hadn't been there before. No one had entered the station. No doors had opened. And yet, it had been watching me. The only proof I had was the voice on the radio. That final whisper. "See you soon." I gripped the steering wheel, my breath shaky. The rational part of me was screaming to walk away, to pretend none of this ever happened. But another part, the part that had spent years chasing after forgotten stories, lost signals, and unexplained phenomena, refused to let it go. So instead of going home, I did the only thing I could. I called Eddie again. He picked up on the first ring. "You need to get out of there." "I know," I said, "but I can't." Silence. Then a heavy sigh. "Tell me everything." We met at a 24-hour diner just outside town. The neon open sign buzzed in the window, casting a flickering red glow over the cracked parking lot. It felt safer than the station. Eddie sat across from me, stirring a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He looked exhausted, like he'd seen something too. I told him everything. The broadcast, the fire, the warnings, the thing in the station. When I finished, he didn't speak right away. He just sat there, staring into his coffee. Finally, he said, "I was hoping I was wrong." I frowned. "Wrong about what?" Eddie rubbed his face. "You ever heard of WZB?" The name sounded vaguely familiar. I shook my head. "No." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It was an old AM station, shut down decades ago. You won't find any official records of it, but people used to talk about it in ham radio circles. It wasn't just some forgotten frequency." He hesitated. "It was a ghost station." I shivered. "What do you mean?" Eddie glanced around the diner, as if making sure no one else could hear us. "People claimed it would pop up at random times, only at night, and always on a frequency that wasn't supposed to exist. 89.7 FM. I swallowed hard. "What did it broadcast?" Eddie's eyes flicked up to meet mine. "Names." A chill crawled down my spine. "People would tune in," he continued, "and the voice would say their names, describe where they were, what they were doing, and then it would predict their deaths." I felt my stomach drop. I thought back to my own broadcast. A young man sits alone in a radio station, listening to a voice he should have ignored. It had been about me. I shook my head. That doesn't make sense. If it was predicting deaths, wouldn't there be records? People would have noticed. "They did," Eddie said grimly. "But the thing is, the people who heard their names, they disappeared. Not just died. They were erased. Like they were never there to begin with." I stared at him. "That's not possible." He gave me a tired, haunted look. "Then explain why there are no records of WZEB." We left the diner just before dawn. I was too wired to sleep, my mind racing through everything Eddie had told me. If WZB was real, if this was the same broadcast, then I was already in danger. I could still hear the voice in my head. Tonight is his final broadcast. I had to shut it down. Eddie hesitated when I told him I was going back to the station. "That's a bad idea, man." "I don't have a choice," I said. "It's broadcasting again. People are listening. What if it names someone else? What if it predicts another death?" He sighed. "Then I'm coming with you." We pulled into the WQPR parking lot just after sunrise. The station looked different in daylight. Less ominous, more like the rundown little building it had always been. But as I stepped inside, I felt it, that same unnatural stillness, like the station was holding its breath. I moved cautiously toward the control room, Eddie close behind. The radio was still on. The dial was still locked on 89.7 FM. But now, the static was louder. It filled the air like a living thing, crawling under my skin. I turned to Eddie. "We cut the signal." He nodded and moved toward the equipment rack, checking the station's transmitter settings. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "We shouldn't even be able to broadcast on this frequency." I grabbed the power switch. "Then let's kill it." I flipped the switch. The radio stayed on. The static didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. Eddie paled. "That's not possible." Then, the voice returned. "We interrupt this silence for an urgent message. Eddie and I froze. The voice was different this time. Distorted. Wrong. Two men stand inside an empty radio station, trying to silence a voice they cannot stop. My blood turned to ice. One will leave. One will not. Eddie cursed under his breath. We need to go. I didn't argue. We bolted for the exit, but as soon as I grabbed the door handle, the lights cut out. The station was plunged into complete darkness. The static surged, filling my ears, my skull, my entire body. It was inside me, crawling through my veins. I felt my vision blur, my head spin, and then a whisper, right next to my ear. Stay! A hand grabbed my wrist. I screamed. I yanked free and stumbled backward, my body slamming against the wall. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting just enough light for me to see. Eddie was gone. I blinked. My head was spinning. He had been right next to me. Hadn't he? Eddie. My voice cracked. No answer. I turned, heart pounding, scanning the room. He was gone. Not just gone. Erased. No footprints. No signs of struggle. And when I checked my phone, there were no calls from him. No messages. No record that he had ever existed. And then, the radio crackled one last time. The voice whispered, "And now, for our next story." I ran. I don't remember how I got home. 1 second, I was inside the station. The next, I was on my couch, staring at the dark screen of my television, my mind blank, like something had wiped the last few minutes from my memory. I checked my phone again. No Eddie. No messages. No missed calls. No proof he had ever existed. But I remembered him. I grabbed my laptop, fingers shaking as I searched his name. Eddie Carter. I looked through Facebook, Twitter, even Old Town records. Nothing. No photos. No friends. No evidence that he had ever been born. I dug through my contacts. His number was still in my phone. But there were no texts. No call history. It was like my phone remembered him just enough to mess with my head. My breathing turned shallow. This was real. This wasn't just some prank, some elaborate hoax. Something had taken him. And I was next. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the voice. And now, for our next story. Every time I woke up, I swore I saw something moving in the corners of my apartment. A shadow that wasn't mine. By the time the sun rose, I had made a decision. I had to destroy the signal. I drove back to WQPR just before noon, when the daylight made the place feel less haunted. I told myself I'd be safe as long as the broadcast only happened at night. I was wrong. The second I stepped inside, I knew something was off. The on-air sign was flickering. Even though no one else should have been in the building, the control room was already broadcasting. I stepped inside, my heart hammering. The static was still there, humming softly from the speakers. And then, a voice. Not the voice. A different one. A woman. I froze. "Hello." I swallowed hard, leaning toward the mic. "Who is this?" The static crackled. Then, hesitantly, "My name is Claire. Can you hear me?" I glanced at the radio dial. 89.7 FM. I gripped the mic tighter. "Where are you broadcasting from?" A long pause. Then, in a broken whisper, "I don't know." The hairs on my arms stood on end. Something about her voice. It wasn't just scared. It was lost, like she had been floating in dead air for a long, long time. My throat went dry. "Claire, what do you remember?" The static deepened. And then, very softly, "They took me." I felt my stomach twist. "Who?" No answer. "Claire, are you?" "I used to work at a radio station." My blood turned to ice. Claire's voice trembled. I tried to stop the signal, too. A high-pitched screech erupted from the speakers. I flinched, covering my ears. And then, they're listening. The line cut out. The static roared back, louder than before, flooding the room. And through it, layered beneath the white noise, I heard something else. Breathing. Close. Right behind me. I turned, and the figure was there. Not behind the glass this time. Not outside. Inside the room. Watching me. I couldn't move. The figure stood in the corner of the control room, half hidden in shadow. Tall, motionless. Its body flickered, like an image on a dying TV screen. There, then gone. There, then gone. But it was getting closer. A cold pressure filled the room, pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. The air smelled like burnt wires and dust, like old electronics left running for too long. The static from the speakers deepened, almost rhythmic, like something was breathing through the radio. And then, the voice. Not Claire. The other one. The one that had been following me since the first broadcast. You shouldn't have answered. The lights in the control room flickered violently. The on-air sign burst, sending shattered glass onto the desk. The thing in the corner lurched forward. I did the only thing I could. I ran. I tore out of the control room, my pulse hammering. The hallways felt wrong. Too long, too narrow, like the station was stretching around me. I stumbled toward the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. The station was locking me inside. Static poured from the speakers overhead, no matter where I went. Then the voice spoke again. You are part of the story now. I forced myself to take a breath. Think, if this was WZB, if this was the same broadcast that had erased Eddie and who knows how many others, then it had to be coming from somewhere. Something was still transmitting the signal, and if I could destroy it, I took off toward the back of the station, where the transmitter room was. The transmitter room was old, filled with dusty racks of tangled cables and outdated equipment that should have been replaced years ago. But one thing didn't belong. A radio, not one of ours, not even an FM set. It was an ancient AM receiver, and it was on. The dial was locked at 89.7 FM. As I stepped closer, the static shifted. For a second, just a second, I saw something in the screen's reflection. A face, not mine, a woman's, Claire. I lunged forward and grabbed the radio, my fingers trembling as I tried to turn the dial. It wouldn't move. The voice returned. We've been waiting for you. The static exploded into a high-pitched screech. I clamped my hands over my ears, my vision swimming. And then, the radio spoke. Not the voice. Not Claire. Someone else. Help me. My breath hitched. Claire. It's not real. Her voice was clearer now, panicked. They're rewriting it. You have to stop them. Break the signal. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the radio with both hands and smashed it against the floor. The impact shattered the plastic casing. Sparks flew as the device cracked open, its insides spilling across the ground. For a moment, silence. Then the entire station shook. The lights flickered wildly. The static screamed. And then, everything went dark. I woke up on the floor. The station was silent. No static. No voices. Just the hum of old, broken equipment. I pushed myself up, wincing. My head throbbed. The shattered radio lay in pieces beside me, dark and lifeless. I checked my phone. 4:03 a.m. Something felt different. I stumbled out of the transmitter room, half expecting the station to shift around me again. But it didn't. The air was still. The control room was empty. The on-air sign was dark. The radio was silent. I exhaled shakily. It was over. At least that's what I thought until I checked my phone. My call history was back. Eddie's name was there. I searched his number and found messages, texts, proof that he had existed. I scrolled back further, found old pictures. He was back. The broadcast had erased him, and now somehow I had brought him back. I let out a shaky laugh, gripping my phone like a lifeline. It was finally over, or so I thought, because as I turned to leave, my gaze flicked toward the control panel. The radio dial had been reset. The station was back on 103.3 FM, but for a moment, just a flicker, I swore I saw the numbers shift. 89.7. A single burst of static crackled through the speaker, and then, silence. I left WQPR that night and never went back. Eddie never remembered what had happened. To him, it was just a normal shift, another forgettable night at the station. I didn't correct him. Some things are better left forgotten. I moved away a few months later, started fresh in a city that didn't know me. But some nights, when I can't sleep, I turn on my radio and let it scan through the frequencies. Most of the time, I hear nothing but music and talk shows. But once, just once, I heard static, and underneath it, so faint I almost missed it, a voice. And now, for our next story, I turned off the radio, and I haven't listened since.